Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking around, and thanks again to the organizers of the conference. I've really enjoyed the last couple of days, and I'm going to speak briefly so that we can bring the rest of you into the conversation, because we've all been talking for some time. And to some degree, I'm a bit of an outlier, maybe on the panel in this conversation, perhaps because of the issues that I've been studying and the groups that I've been working with for some years now. And Jonathan mentioned that often people who are sort of read as irregular are the unacceptable transgression that everyone can agree on. I thought that was a provocative and apt phrase. And they're often silenced in the kind of formalized global governance regimes and agreements that are getting more attention these days. So people who are without authorization when they cross borders or work, people who are perhaps seeking asylum, occupying interstitial spaces between the formal categories of migration, or even interstitial spaces between nation states are often silenced in the conversations. So for the last few years, I've been the principal investigator on a project funded by the National Science Foundation in the US that's studying the management of migration on islands. So how do some of these issues come to the fore? Struggles around entry, struggles around exclusion, partial forms of citizenship, and so on. How can we understand them through the lens of what's happening on certain islands? And our field sites have been Italy's Lampedusa Island near Tunisia, Australia's Christmas Island close to Indonesia, and also the U.S., what the UN Committee on Decolonization calls one of the last remaining colonies in the world, which is Guam and Saipan. Again, bits of territory where people often try to enter the U.S. or in the other contexts to enter the EU or to enter Australia to make asylum claims or to enter as economic migrants. And there's this debate in island studies about whether islands are in fact these kind of experimental, bizarre, peripheral zones that are really where anathema things happen, where things that would not normally happen on mainland territory go on, or whether in fact islands are central to how we understand broader global phenomena or sovereign power or what's happening on mainland sovereign territories. And I thought it'd be kind of interesting to move that debate about islands and what place they occupy into this discourse about global governance. So to ask the same question, how do we understand struggles over global migration on islands in relation to global governance? Are they in fact, sort of strange, outlier, bizarre, experimental things that are happening, very contingent and ad hoc forms of migration management? Or in fact, can we understand them as a form of global governance that tells us a lot about the kinds of arrangements and power relations that are infused through these broad discourses and debates that my colleagues have been talking about so far today. Now, obviously, I've started down this path, so you know that I side with the latter part of the debate, that islands are at the center of the world. And once you start studying islands, or if you're from an island, you can't help but see them you can't help but sort of see islands everywhere you look and start to understand so many things in the world through the lens of islands, asymmetrical, colonial and neo-colonial relations on which the world runs, partial forms of citizenship and governance, the ways that populations and places too are exploited. And I think access to citizenship and mobility is one great example where you have layers upon layers of kind of marginalization and partial forms of citizenship, struggles over self-governance, and so on. So in my few minutes, I'm going to make that kind of provocative argument that we look to islands and offshore enforcement to understand what's actually happening on the ground, or something that's happening on the ground that's important around global governance. And it brings in issues of securitization, externalization, important issues that have been discussed at this conference, but as people have said, aren't necessarily on the sort of agenda of global governance in a sustained way, or certainly not in a kind of celebrated way as other topics are. But we have to understand sort of and locate the for example, 55,000 people who were intercepted and or landed on Lampedusa in 2011 during the uprising. These are substantial numbers. And they're also policymakers often call groups that are processed offshore or intercepted mixed flows, right? So people will fit into all these different categories of migration. Some will be deemed economic migrants moving for better livelihoods. Others are seeking asylum, will be displaced, will fit into the convention definition of a refugee. Some will become detainees. Some will be would-be refugee claimants or would-be asylum seekers, but can never formally reach sovereign territory in a place where they can actually make an asylum claim. So we see this kind of use of geography to push people offshore. And so I think the island and the offshore processing can be used as a location to question some of the contradictions and silences central to discourse on global governance. These groups aren't necessarily the kind of neoliberal subjects or agents of change that are being celebrated by the kind of diaspora discussion, whose economic potential or role is celebrated or desired. Instead, we often see that these populations of migrants and asylum seekers are racialized and securitized as others and kind of managed elsewhere, often posited as threats to national security and deemed what policymakers call spontaneous arrivals, so not expected and so managed in particular ways. And a lot of the sort of enforcement practices that I've been studying, you could almost see as efforts to evade or undermine global governance regimes. So for example, for refugees, there's actually quite a global regime of migration management, right? Centralized through the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. We could look at this as a multi-level issue. It's the way political scientists often talk about it. So you have the global organization, you have donor states, you have local groups that practice resettlement, and it's through all these institutional arrangements that resettlement happens. And it's in a way it's highly formalized. But many of the other ways are highly informal that people are trying to get to places. And I think something that's important is that on the one hand, people, sort of migrants and all of us who cross a border are either looking to sometimes occupy a category or work a particular policy to move, and then at other times we're evading certain kinds of legibility and policies and categories, and states are doing the same thing. Authorities are often also doing the same thing. So for example, some of the practices offshore around interception and detention have to do with undermining commitments to the convention. So for example, by detaining people on islands, Australia creates a two-tier system of access to asylum where people who are held offshore have fewer mechanisms of accessing asylum. They may be able to access it, but they have fewer rights to appeal, or because of where they are, no legal representation, and so on. Or we have, as another example, Australia detaining or transferring funds to Indonesia to develop detention centers, 12 to 14 detention centers across Indonesia. And so there's a kind of very complex set of institutional arrangements through which these things, and transfers, economic transfers, through which these arrangements take place. And they are multi-level. There are many actors involved, some public, some private, some human rights organizations who are monitoring things, other kinds of third parties that Jenna mentioned, like the International Organization for Migration, the Red Cross, Médecins Sans Frontières. And then we have both formal and informal kinds of arrangements. So people have mentioned formal, multilateral, regional consultative practices. Then there are also more informal or hidden from view kinds of bilateral arrangements between states through which people, for example, might be returned. So Australia or the US or Canada, they have all these bilateral arrangements, and it's often hard to find out any information about them because they're not necessarily public, but have to do precisely with certain kinds of exclusion and mobility, returning people, and so on. And so I think of this kind of enforcement archipelago spreading offshore, again, thinking of the state, as Margaret mentioned, as itself a transnational kind of complex institution and assemblage of people, tactics, policies, private actors, and so on, practicing various forms, very sophisticated forms of processing and exclusion offshore, forms to which they're a lot of forms of profit attached, right? So detention offshore has become a really big industry, and it's private companies who are sometimes making a lot of the money there. So just to wrap up, I want to ask, what are some of the implications for what's happening offshore to these broader questions around global governance? Why and how are some populations celebrated and others not? If governance involves making populations legible to state authorities, how are they being made legible? Who's being made legible in what ways? And what are the implications of this for scholarship, for researchers? How can we think through methods, for example, that have to do with the collecting of data? And I thought Rajan's examples were great, the way he was sort of questioning the numbers and where they came from. Similarly, there's a realm of formal knowledge and a realm of informal knowledge around migration governance. And so how can we design research methodology that captures both the formal and the informal kinds of information that we need to know to understand what's really happening on the ground alongside what you might find written into policy documents or the more formal kind of global dialogues that people have talked about. And just to end, the last piece I'll bring up is the issue of rights and human rights in all of this. And again, Jenna talked about this around workers. When you have offshore, hybrid, complicated arrangements happening where people are in these highly kind of temporary, ad hoc, crisis-driven situations where they may not be able to seek asylum. So, for example, if there are people trying to get to Australia to seek asylum, but they're held in Indonesia, which is not a signatory, so they can't necessarily. What happens when people's rights are violated offshore? And there have been great, human rights reports documenting, for example, what's going on in Libya, Tunisia, in what's called the revolving door, where people are trying to get into the EU or trying to get to Australia and held offshore, where there are really terrible detention conditions and so on. So I think rights are one thing that can also be brought to the table more forcefully than they have been in the global governance discussion. Thanks.